Of Sun Records owner Sam Phillips, rock and roll's first authentic wild man, Jerry Lee Lewis, once said, "Sam's crazy, nutty as a fox squirrel. He's just like me. He ain't got no sense. Birds of a feather flock together. It took all of us to screw up the world. We've done it." Jerry Lee Lewis, for all his delusional megalomania and metastasized ego, acknowledged the ultimate spiritual truths of our existence. He likewise recognized his responsibility in destroying his life and those around him with his transgressions of that truth. He publicly realized his culpability in assisting the enemy of God and humanity to usher in his counterfeit kingdom. To some of his own faithful, he was their God. Through him, they vicariously blazed like the Wicker Man, often as we are prone to do in celebrity culture with misdirected worship and idolatry. Jerry Lee Lewis has, at long last, flown away home. It's a challenge piecing together Jerry Lee in terms of this channel's mission of connecting spiritual warfare and pop culture. Not for any lack of raw material. If anything, there's too much fodder in the killer's sordid and chaotic life and career to even enumerate. The challenge is this is an artist who has been an intensely personal experience and influence on me since my teens. There's that, and the wading through the feelings of loss and grief that accompany his passing. I experienced something similar at the passing of his fellow members in Sun Records' so-called $1 Million Quartet, Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash. I suspect I may feel it when the time comes for Gordon Lightfoot and Bob Dylan, in spite of my spiritual misgivings about that kind of idolatry. But the lines blur more with Jerry Lee Lewis. We shared a birthday, a middle name, and a native state. More than that, at least in my youth, we shared a propensity for batshit crazy feral acts on the edge of sanity, with a wary and worried eye cast to the whirlwind our soul was diving headlong into, often to its own great peril and uncertain survival. And oh yeah, not a lot of thought about how all of this mayhem may affect other souls reluctantly sucked into the vortex. My two best friends at Hendrix College in Arkansas, Tom Adams and Steve Wilkerson, called me from the gates of Graceland the day that Elvis died. I offered that it was a sad day indeed. Wilkerson countered that it would be a Saturday when Jerry Lee died. No argument there. The wild man from Faraday, Louisiana, embodied the same madness the three of us were afflicted with in our lunatic full moon pedal to the metal spin-outs, dirt roading in the Arkansas backwoods. Tom Adams, the adept wheelman, helming my 1969 Pontiac Custom, all of us, along with Gail Sammartino, Mark Jacob, and Guyan Ransom, crammed into this thrill, screaming with glee, "We're all gonna die!" as our whirling dervish auto spun around, heading for God only knew what abyss. Tom Adams and Steve Wilkerson have gone home in the last year, having spent the several previous in the peaceful sanctuary of their loving families and their faith in the Messiah. No more tears for them, just for those of us who love them. From what I know, Jerry Lee found much the same in his final decade with his beloved wife Judith. The Lord in his mercy slowed Jerry Lee's long-suffering, seemingly invincible body down with arthritis and a stroke, perhaps allowing the better angels of his nature to drive out the noxious demons he had invited in most of life to wreak hellish havoc on him and everyone unfortunate enough to be within range. Stoking the flames of his hellfire while finding his fear of damnation quaint, the high priesthood of rock writers loved Jerry Lee for what he was not. They, like the killer himself at his genuinely abominable worst, mistook the death throes of demonization for feats of superhuman nerve and strength. But in truth, he was, in the main, the double-minded man of the Bible's James 1 and 8, unstable in all his ways. Pride will give you a blind side, and Jerry Lee Lewis spent much of his time being double blind. Perhaps some of that was generational curse, maybe courtesy of his rich uncle and family patriarch Lee Calhoun. Cousin preacher Jimmy Swaggart incurred the wrath of his kin by calling out Uncle Lee on his deathbed as a vile, vulgar, profane old man who, as he was edging closer to the abyss, could swear he felt the heat of hell singeing his feet. At his 1969 funeral, an even mightier patriarch roughly grabbed Jerry Lee by the arm and chastised him for being such a dumb bastard and not listening to Lee Calhoun. That particular patriarch was oil billionaire and sometimes Kennedy assassination figure H.L. Hunt. Maybe Daddy Elmo and Mama Mamie inadvertently created a Frankenstein, marveling at and doting upon his apparently God-given talent, which manifested the moment he climbed up Uncle Lee Calhoun's piano stool and proceeded to stun the household like the prodigy he was. Jerry Lee was about 6 years old. 3 years before, a drunk driver had sped through the neighborhood recklessly, killing his elder brother Elmo Jr. Like all four members of Sun Records' $1 Million Quartet, the course of Jerry Lee's life was determined by the death of an older brother. He would be an only child for 5 years until the birth of sister Frankie Jean, and he became his mother's center of attention. I spent an afternoon with Frankie Jean at the home she and Jerry Lee grew up in some years back, and my wife was tickled pink to see someone not let me get a word in edgewise. Frankie Jean said her brother was truly the golden child. She once said that with all the attention, all that special treatment, Mama and Daddy put something inside of Jerry. In a way, in a nice way, they put hell in him. I do think this is possibly where Jerry Lee picked up the idea that he was the center of the universe and didn't have to abide by the same rules that normal mortals do. He was never allowed to use his precious hands for farm work, which fell to the parents and other children. One of the things I remember about my first meeting with Jerry Lee Lewis was the softness of his hands when we shook. It was Rosie's nightclub in New Orleans, and it was Jerry Lee's 43rd birthday and my 22nd birthday. I had heard all the horror stories of his dope and liquor rampages and the smashing of bottles on the skulls of fans who crowded his space. But I didn't think of any of that as he walked by our table. I stood up and introduced myself, and as his bodyguard stepped towards me, Jerry Lee just held up his hand and waved him off. I stammered through a bit of talk and found the notorious killer, at least on that night, as gracious and filled with the Lord's own peace as a man could be. Back on stage later that evening, he asked the crowd what they wanted to hear, and I shouted out his early anthem to Making the Mad Night All the Way, End of the Road, one of the few whose lyrics he penned entirely by himself. He just laughed and shook his head, saying, "Man, you must be from Louisiana." I don't doubt that the special treatment of Jerry Lee received from his parents may have encouraged the narcissism and impulsiveness that wrought hell through his lifetime on anyone unlucky enough to be in the vicinity. I also don't doubt that this was a doorway through which unclean spirits entered and exploited the opportunities he seemed to endlessly offer them. When he turned professional in 1949 at the age of 14, drugs and alcohol opened up more stargates for the demons that would make him their home through the 73-year career he enjoyed. The kind of ego he allowed inevitably becomes a voracious beast, one you can never feed enough. Jerry Lee frequently expressed his bewilderment at his own behavior, not quite grasping why he did the things he did. But Mother Mamie and the Assembly of God had given him a firm sense of the spiritual reality engaging us. But on Jerry Lee's behalf, or in further condemnation of him, depending on your perspective, he never lost sight of the difference between right and wrong, or what I consider to be a truthful assessment of the spiritual reality we find ourselves in. This was famously demonstrated, fortunately for history, in front of a hot mic during an equally hot debate between 21-year-old Jerry Lee Lewis and Sun Records owner Sam Phillips on whether or not to record the next song on the list. Jerry Lee felt the song was blasphemy and was balking. The song was Great Balls of Fire. At one point, a clearly exasperated and going on the offensive Sam Phillips tells his young rock star, "Now look, Jerry, religious conviction doesn't mean anything resembling extremism. Do you mean to tell me that you're going to take the Bible, you're going to take God's word, and you're going to revolutionize the whole universe? Jesus Christ came into this world and he tolerated man. He didn't preach from one pulpit. He went around and he did good." Now here Sam Phillips is showing us his "we all worship the same God" Freemason roots. Sam was DeMolay in high school, which is the junior branch of the Freemasons. My guess is that Sam either consciously knew or was inspired by spirits in sympathy with his counter-Christ perspective. What he was doing when he named his son, he knew what he was doing when he named his label Sun, the symbol of the ancient pagan deity, in sync with the Egyptian Ra and the Greek Apollo and Helios. Likewise, his assembling of the $1 Million Quartet of Elvis, Jerry Lee, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash, whose birthdays just happen to correspond to the astrological alchemical combination of earth, air, fire, and water. On a personally odd note, they also correspond to the exact birthdays of my eldest child, myself, my mother, and the conception date of my youngest child. But in the recorded Donnybrook, Jerry Lee ain't having it. That is to say, ain't having Sam's take on Jesus and the Bible, and consequently the possible sacrilege of Great Balls of Fire. Sam eventually counters with a real stunner for Jerry Lee, claiming that with rock and roll you can save souls. The singer is clearly horrified and protests, shrieking, "No, no, no, no! How can the devil save souls? What in the world are you talking about? I have the devil in me. If I didn't, I'd be a Christian." It's worth noting here that in this same dialogue, Jerry Lee makes a crucial theological error in stating that you have to be so good to enter heaven. He seems oblivious to the biblical point that you don't go to heaven for being good and you don't go to hell for being bad. It is instead a matter of whether or not you accept the gift that the sacrifice of Messiah presents you with. That as God's creation is one of order, he was required to pay the penalty for the original sin and the sins engendered by all of us subsequent to the fallen state of reality. Perhaps that is what Jerry Lee meant, because the Messiah sacrifice does render us clean to go into the kingdom of God. But I would imagine with such a point of view that Jerry Lee would sometimes feel condemned much of life, sometimes falling into the why bother mentality. And surely Jerry Lee Lewis would have a lot to bother with. It's hard to imagine a more sordid behavior on the part of anyone who doesn't spend most of their time institutionalized. Dope and alcohol addict, abusive physically and emotionally to women, a big league fornicator, even by rock star standards. Some would throw in the questionable deaths of one or two of his wives also. But with wife number 8, Judith, if my account is correct, he seems to have finally struck gold and had finally reached a point in life where it was not physically feasible to sin against his marriage with the legendary vigor he displayed in the previous 7. In an interview in Hollywood's Palomino Club in 1976, he said, "Jerry Lee Lewis is a sinner lost and undone, without God or his son." He said Satan stopped him from being a church-going person out of the weakness of Jerry Lee Lewis. I'm one of the most weakest people in the world when it comes to religion. But there's no such thing as religion anyway. The Bible doesn't even speak of religion. It's salvation. He went on to say how he needed to devote himself to preaching and give his life to God. He saw himself as a failure. I'm 41 years old and it's cost me 2 sons and my mother. Asked how that was his fault, he said, I've been the hard-headedest cat that's ever been. I don't know why I'm that way. It's draining my body dry. I don't understand. I don't know why I'm not man enough to walk out that door and do what I'm supposed to do, because if I don't, I'm going to go to hell. I really don't know, man, what's wrong with me. What am I doing here in a nightclub? I can't give an altar call here. This won't get me into heaven. He feared when he stood before the Lord in judgment that the Lord would say, depart from me, you worker of iniquity. I never knew you. Jerry Lee was also an era when he said that Satan has power next to God and Satan has more power than Jesus. He tempted him for 40 days, said Jerry Lee, and 40 nights, and he nearly got him. Jerry Lee told the interviewer in 1976 that he was getting a divorce and this would be his last marriage, and that if he goes back into the ministry, God intends for me to be by myself. Well, we see how that worked out. Asked how Satan benefits from your entertaining people, he said, because I'm dragging the audience to hell with me. How am I going to get into heaven with a whole lot of shaking going on? You can't serve 2 masters. You'll hate one and love the other. The following is, believe it or not, only a very partial list of the mishaps in Jerry Lee's colorful life. On his 41st birthday, September 29, 1976, he accidentally shot his bass player, Butch Owens, in the chest. On October the 12th, Jerry Lee was arrested at his estranged wife Jaren's house and charged with disorderly conduct for shouting obscenities at her neighbors in the street. On November 22nd, same year, he flipped over his Rolls Royce. Somehow he registered 0 on the breathalyzer, but the police said he was acting intoxicated. 12 hours later, his father Elmo was arrested and charged with DUI. 10 hours after Jerry Lee was released from jail, he went to Graceland and waved a pistol in the air. He got arrested. He entered Doctors Hospital on November 25th. His wife Sharon entered St. Joseph Hospital the same day for bad nerves. Who can blame her? January 17th, Jerry Lee had his gallbladder removed at Doctors Hospital. June 22nd, Jerry Lee was seized by police for driving his Rolls Royce under the influence of drugs. On February 23, 1978, he was rushed to the emergency room of Baptist Hospital, suffering respiratory distress. Media announced that he was dead. Wouldn't be the last time they got it wrong. April 1st, he cursed and walked out on his audience in Walker, Louisiana. He passed out before he was able to get off the stage. In 1981, years of bad living really caught up with Jerry Lee, and he was sent to the hospital in critical condition with perforations in his stomach, half of which had to be removed. He was given up for dead once again, and quite a number of his colleagues made the trek to the hospital to say goodbye. He was pretty skinny for a while, but he bounced back. I remember being in the student union at the University of New Orleans the day he went into the hospital. I hadn't heard anything, but I was telling my friends at the table that I just knew something was wrong with Jerry Lee Lewis because I had a dream about it, a very vivid one. Well, who could explain such things? Against all rhyme and reason, it seems God gave Jerry Lee long life. Must have had a plan. In 1970, Jerry Lee's concert price rose to $10,000 a night. He recorded a live album at the International Hotel in May. Jerry Lee Lewis Jr. was 15 and had left his mother and was traveling with his father. Jerry Lee bought an airplane the same year. November 9th, 1970, Myra Gale filed a divorce suit against him. Tarp Tarrant, Jerry Lee's drummer, Jerry Lee had told him to teach Junior how to be a drummer. He quickly found out that Junior was strung out on all kinds of dope. Jerry Lee accused Tarp of getting him strung out. Tarp said he would sometimes wake up and a drunken Jerry Lee would have a knife against his throat. About this time, Jerry Lee got saved and announced to the world he would not perform at nightclubs anymore because they serve liquor, and that he was going to do 15 minutes of gospel music at the end of each show and give his testimony, and he did for a while. Mamie died the week after Easter at the stroke of midnight, April 21st. His first son, Steve Allen Lewis, toddled into the family pool and drowned on Easter as well. Jerry Lee Lewis Jr. died at age 19 when the Jeep he was driving flipped over in 1973. In 1982, his estranged wife, that is Jerry Lee Lewis's estranged wife, Sharon, drowned in a swimming pool weeks before the divorce was finalized. In 1983, his wife of 77 days, Shawn Stevens, officially died from a methadone overdose, but an investigative reporter is convinced that Jerry Lee Lewis got away with murder. Jerry's eighth and final wife, Judith, was the ex-wife of one of Myra's uncles, if I'm recollecting that correctly. Myra Gale Brown was the so-called child bride. The nuptials created enough of a stir to destroy Jerry Lee's career as a rock star, but commenced a 14-year marriage he defends to this very day. Myra was 13 and Jerry 22 at the time. And while this is clearly wrong in the present society, it was acceptable in backwoods Louisiana at the time, as was cousin marriage, something else that wrinkles my nose and furrows my brow. First cousins are barred from marriage in a bare minority of states, and I was surprised to find that out. That's true to this day. In most, it's not against the law with stipulations. Jerry Lee's sister, Frankie Jean, who appears in photographs with me and my wife, Ronette, in this slideshow, was married at ages 12 and 15. A very questionable practice, but not totally outside the societal norms of that time and place. As an aside, Myra's father, J.W. Brown, the first man to play electric guitar on live television and a member of Jerry Lee Lewis's band, also recently passed away at age 96 after nearly 80 years of marriage undertaken when he and Lois were teenagers. Pardon me. The late Robert Palmer, in his book Jerry Lee Lewis Rocks, speaks of cults in the backwaters of civilization who practice experiential contact with the ineffable. They generally contact the divine through music, featuring repetitive drumming or hand clapping. This triggers trance and what cult members interpret as possession by spirits. In these trances, they perform unusual feats of strength and exhibit insensitivity to pain. Like most rock critics, Robert Palmer sees this as a reaction to oppression and an attempt to cope with pressures by bringing them to the surface and acting them out. In this vein, he says that rock and roll is a kind of ecstatic religion whose true believers, misfits all, get together and express themselves in a prescribed, culturally timed manner by rocking out. He goes on to say, I guess that makes Jerry Lee Lewis some kind of priest or shaman. Maybe rock and roll can save souls, like Sam Phillips said, as well as destroy them. Well, this kind of counter-Christ philosophy has filled the cemeteries, the prisons, the orphanages, and the insane asylums of the planet Earth. Palmer was no exception, completely decimating his liver with alcohol and drugs and suffering a major health collapse before dying at age 52, awaiting a liver transplant. He had expressed his belief that drug taking was risky, but it was part of a glorious Dionysian heritage, to use his own words. Unfortunately, the supposed glory of this Dionysian heritage, in conviction or unconsciously in behavior, is part of the mystique animating the personal lives and fan base of Jerry Lee and many celebrities. Intelligentsia from major media like Robert Palmer strongly encourage youths like myself to equate self-destruction with superpowers, poisoning one's mind and body with intoxicants as some kind of sacred right of autonomy, self-expression, and higher consciousness. We ended up, most of us, dead, in prison, crazy, or alone, while they collected paychecks from corporations aligned with the GTO, the global techno-occult, manipulating us to embrace the suicide heritage of Dionysius. They conspicuously omitted the rites of that cult that included dismemberment of live animals and human beings. All the more shame because Jerry Lee Lewis had much more to offer from the other side of his double-minded self. He reached the pinnacle of rock and roll success with an astounding 1968 comeback. He became a #1 country artist as well. He did so through an unequaled musicality, not only technically, but by having the roadhouse and honky-tonk chops to seamlessly absorb all of the currents of American music: hillbilly, boogie-woogie, barrel house blues, ragtime, rhythm, Al Jolson, and Broadway. A virtuoso piano man and consummate singer, an unparalleled purveyor of emotion from unbridled joy to reflective melancholy. I remember seeing him just after his father, Mr. Elmo, died in 1979. Jerry Lee was performing on the steamship President on a night cruise up the Mississippi River from the New Orleans French Quarter. It was the first time I ever heard him sing Over the Rainbow from his then new album, a song so identified with Judy Garland's perfect rendition that mere mortals best shy away from even trying. It was the most deeply textured, heart-touching experience I've ever had at a concert. We all knew he was singing to his daddy. He stopped in the middle of it for a moment, fingers still lightly tickling the ivory, saying, "Friends, I've seen so many loved ones come and go in this world. I just thank God for being here." If you were there, you would have known for sure that at least for that moment, Jerry Lee Lewis knew redemption, and that like him, none of us were as bad as our worst sins. Which brings us up to some of the more sinister possibilities in Jerry Lee's life. I won't be addressing the wife murder accusation. That's covered elsewhere on the internet. Instead, I want to look at an equally dark possibility from the dirty world of covert intelligence and MK Ultra trauma-based mind control. Jerry's name and that of close associates like Chris Christopherson have been repeatedly brought up in possible connection with this. Several people claim to have freed themselves from this horrifically abusive government program and have staked out the precarious turf of the whistleblower. Most noted of these is Kathy O'Brien. Her story is that of an infant. As an infant, her father gave her up to a subdivision of MK Ultra called Project Monarch. Monarch was a CIA program that sought out multi-generational victims of sexual abuse, like Kathy's father and Kathy, offering them freedom after arrest on sexual charges in exchange for their cooperation with the program and sometimes the training of their offspring. This training, too horrible to describe, consists of severe sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, which causes the mind of the subject to fragment into compartmentalized, separate personalities in defense. These personalities, in turn, are programmed to be assassins, sex slaves to politicians and other high-level operatives, and human computers who can courier sensitive information without leaving a trail. Kathy O'Brien has said that she has worked in all those capacities and was considered a top so-called presidential model sex slave, the first of which was Marilyn Monroe. Some whistleblowers like Fritz Springmeier and Cisco Wheeler have claimed that Jerry Lee Lewis was known in those circles as a particularly cruel programmer of trauma-based mind control slaves. I have, however, yet to hear eyewitness testimony or evidence to this effect. Chris Christopherson figured prominently throughout much of Jerry Lee's life, as did his fellow Sun Records and Million Dollar Quartet stablemate Johnny Cash. Christopherson was a highly visible presence in Jerry Lee's last days, accepting the Country Music Hall of Fame induction for him and presenting it to Jerry on his sickbed. Kathy O'Brien purports to have had a great deal of abusive experience with Christofferson going back to 1979. She says the Oxford Rhodes Scholar and multi-generational military man and athlete is a Vatican-based monarch slave runner. On pages 116 through 119 of her book, Transformation of America, Miss O'Brien details torture and abuse at the hands of Christofferson and Army Colonel Michael Aquino, who founded the Temple of Set after breaking from Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. O'Brien says both favored high voltage electric shock torture and neither had any regard for human life. Both also reported to former KKK member and U.S. Senate Majority Whip Robert Byrd, who Kathy says was her owner in the murky world of monarch slaves. Byrd, confident of his total control of her, would often use her as a sounding board to hear his own voice. Byrd said that total mind control in the New World Order was the goal he was working towards, and that even the Pope and the Mormon prophet knew about all of this and fully cooperated. An end goal for the severely racist Byrd was to create the superior race along Nazi and KKK principles to annihilate the underprivileged races and cultures through genocide, and by altering genetics to breed the more gifted, the blondes of this world, in his opinion. Might I add that many of us, myself included, have foolishly provided our DNA to family ancestry companies, and even more of us have recently taken a gene-altering shot in the arm, possibly the first of many required by some manufactured emergency. All of this, of course, would require a great deal more research and evidence if possible. Suffice it to say that Kathy O'Brien has accused many well-known politicians and celebrities, including Dick Cheney, Jimmy Buffett, Gerald Ford, and others, of the most unspeakable acts of sexual and physical abuse against herself, her child, and many others. It seems significant that none of these people have ever filed a cease and desist order or have taken any legal action of any kind against her. To me, this indicates that either they wish this kind of information, true or not, to be circulating for some reason, or else they do not wish to draw attention. Whether Jerry Lee Lewis was involved in such activity or not, I cannot say. But as much as I have enjoyed his music, I would be remiss in my obligations to this channel's mission to link pop culture and spiritual warfare if I didn't mention that this accusation was very much in the wind. So Jerry Lee is gone in October, Halloween weekend, and will be laid to rest on the 5th of November. Remember. The time travel date of Back to the Future, symbolic in the interpretation of Casey Brown's Enter the Stars channel, of the unclean spirits lurching from body to body through time. Jerry Lee, as is so often said, was the last man standing, the last major founder of rock and roll, and the last of the Sun Records $1 Million Quartet, which itself was possibly one of the most important magical workings of all time. The spirits of rock and roll and country music that were unleashed there in Memphis, named after Egypt's mystical city, have transformed us socially more in the 66 years since than in all previous history. 66, the number of Apollo. As we move towards the New World Order of the global techno-occult, the NWO of the GTO, it is out with the old and in with the new, just as Apollo's arrow through the chest or the serpent on the chest of Superman's costume symbolizes the pseudo-time travel of demonic spirits pushing the original spirit aside or out of the body as they take possession. Out with the old, in with the new. In our world, hypersexuality is seamlessly devolving into virtual, no human contact sex. Obsessive self-expression ironically dissolves into a new collective consciousness, with adults as defensive about getting their feelings hurt as toddlers. Nonetheless, by God's grace, none of us deserves to be judged by our worst actions. Appearances seem to indicate that Jerry Lee endeavored to be a good husband and a follower of the Messiah in the last decade of his life. The only project he ever talked about since 2014 was a gospel album. And one time, when he got in the studio to lay down some vocal tracks for this, he says he was actually able to play with his arm which has been paralyzed since the stroke. Perhaps we'll hear some of that. At any rate, in August, he released a gospel album with Jimmy Swaggart, a limited release through his cousin's ministry. Like many of his fans, I'd like to think that this is the note that Jerry Lee Lewis left this world on. I do know that he never ceased to publicly advocate that Messiah was the way, no matter how bad his behavior. And he always admitted that it was his own spiritual weakness that kept him from walking that straight and narrow. 35 years ago, the Orange County Register ran a list that was making the rounds entitled People Most Likely to Be Dead Any Minute. The top spot was a two-way tie between Jerry Lee Lewis and Keith Richards. Until this week, against all odds, they were both still vertical instead of horizontal. This is Gumbo Craig, and this is Walking Out of Babylon. All glory to the Most High God. Jerry Lee Lewis, rest in peace. Shalom.